Bueno, buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta última conferencia del cuarto ciclo de conferencias sobre la democracia hoy. Tengo el placer, el gusto de presentarles a Simon Tormey es catedrático de Teoría Política y director del Departamento de Ciencias Políticas y Relaciones Internacionales en la Universidad de Sydney. Anteriormente ha ejercido de profesor en la Universidad de Nottingham desde el 90 hasta el 2009. Es autor de numerosos libros, entre los cuales se incluyen Agnes Heller, Socialismo, Autonomía y la Postmodernidad, bueno, pues sigo en inglés, Anticapitalism, Key Thinker from Critical Theory to Post-Marxism, y además ha publicado artículos en revistas prestigiosas como Radical Philosophy, Thesis 11, The Journal of Political Ideologies, Political Studies, Historical Materialism. Durante muchos años ha sido editor de la revista Contemporary Political Theory. En la actualidad está trabajando en un nuevo libro, Politics After Representation, un proyecto que le ha traído precisamente a España con el fin de analizar lo que considera que es uno de los contextos más apasionantes en cuanto al dinamismo de participación ciudadana. Yo simplemente quiero dar las gracias de todo corazón por estar con nosotros y por el esfuerzo que ha hecho para estar hoy aquí entre nosotros, y también recordarles a todos ustedes que el año que viene, el año próximo, seguiremos con este ciclo de conferencias, y nuestra idea es, desde la universidad y como parte del compromiso público de la universidad, establecer unas relaciones más firmes y más estables con los movimientos sociales y con las iniciativas ciudadanas que tenemos en Castellón, y poderles darle también cobertura teórica a todo lo que podamos desde la propia universidad. Gracias, profesor Tormey, por estar con nosotros, y cuando quiera.
Thank you very much. An apology and three thanks. An apology because I'm speaking in English. I would much prefer to be speaking in Spanish, but I hope if I speak slowly enough, and we've written up the overhead in Spanish as well, that you'll be able to follow, and that's an apology. Three thanks, if I can as well, before we start the lecture. This is a great opportunity for me to thank Ramon Fienstra, who has been an incredible source of support and contacts, an intellectual collaborator, and an all-round nice guy, as we would say in English. So I really want to thank Ramon for his role in bringing me to Spain and for helping out for two visits, one in Barcelona. He gave up his family's time and his teaching time to help me in Barcelona, and here in Castellón and Valencia. Thank you very much, Ramon. Secondly, I'd like to thank the University of Castellón and my colleagues Domingo as well as Ramon for this very prestigious invitation to come and speak. Very generous at very hard times in Spanish higher education. I want to reassure everybody in the room that they didn't fly me from Australia, so there is some money left in the education budget for next year. But nonetheless, it was a very generous invitation, and I'm very touched and appreciative of the university for showing their support. Finally, I want to thank the activists of Castellón, Barcelona and Valencia, and many of you are here in the audience, extraordinarily generous with your time. I can't believe how much time that people have given up to speak to an Australian-based professor who will disappear back on a plane, probably never see them again, but the generosity of spirit and the desire to want to help a foreigner understand the situation in Spain, and also to enter into a dialogue. So it's always been a conversation. Activists have asked me my view, whilst I listen to their view. And I very much admire the spirit of many people in this room and the activists in Spain. Very, very difficult time. Where you get that energy and passion from, I don't know. But if you could put it in a bottle, I would drink some of that, and I'd be a very happy man and live a very long time. So thank you very much to those activists. And for anyone who's not here, but who shared those conversations, please send my thanks back to those comrades as well. It's astonishing what you've been doing. Okay, well, we're here to talk about the crisis of representative politics, which I should just explain a little bit about the nature of this project. I'm a political theorist by training, so most of my time I spend reading books But even those who spend time reading books can't ignore the nature of the crisis which is in front of us. And of course, in Spain, you have this very acute crisis of representation, which made it very interesting for me to come and talk to activists and participants in what's going on. There are really, what I wanted to do was to write a philosophical and theoretical book about the crisis of representation. But the nature of my work is to use empirical case studies from Spain and France and Brazil, Turkey and so on, to illustrate the nature of the crisis that we're in. So we'll talk a little bit about Spain here, but it's also a much more general phenomenon, this. And I accentuate that even in a place like Australia, I'll illustrate for you the problem in Australia as well as in Spain. You don't hear much about Australia in the news, but we have the same crisis. So just a little overview of what the talk is going to be about. It's a very broad, general talk, and the idea is therefore to give everyone a chance to have their own view on it, and of course I'll welcome questions at the end of the lecture. So, overview, what's happening? I won't try to say the Spanish bit, but you'll be able to follow me as I go through. What's happening? Why is it happening? So we want to explain the crisis. What are the dominant forms of explanation? What is my hypothesis about what's going on? What does it mean for politics? So a crisis of representation, for many of my political science colleagues, is the same as a crisis of politics. There is no politics beyond representation. So I want to make a separation between representative politics and other kinds of politics. That's pretty unfashionable in the political science discipline. And of course, lastly, what you'll want to be talking about as well is what this means for democracy. Where does democracy go? What is our understanding of democracy as we move into the 21st century? So let's start with what's happening. When you talk to political scientists, those are my colleagues in my discipline and Ramon's discipline, they like numbers a lot. And the numbers are pretty ugly when it comes to assessing the health of representative politics. And the four kinds of numbers that political scientists are interested in tend to be along these lines here. So decline in voter turnout, especially subnational and supranational elections. So national elections are slightly different. Subnational, disastrous. Supranational, pretty disastrous. Secondly, decline in the membership of political parties. And I want to show you a little bit of data about what that looks like, because it's quite a shock, actually, when people are used to thinking that political parties are the dominant actors in democracy. Thirdly, a decline in trust in politicians. And lastly, a decline in interest in parliamentary affairs. And again, I'll come back to that. But I want to show you a little bit of data to get you kind of thinking about this. So let me just see if I can bring up this other lecture which I gave here. So if you stick this up here. So I don't have a lot of data to hand about Spain, but I have looked it up today, and the pattern is fairly similar. So here's a little bit of data. Voter turnout in general elections from 6 countries between 1960 and 2010. So it's not a linear decline in terms of voter turnout. These are the national elections. These are the most influential kind of elections. But if you look at the top line, that's Germany, is the yellow line. The next one down, UK general elections. Next one down, Japan, and blue is India, and red is the US presidential. So not a linear decline, and many of my political science colleagues say, crisis, what crisis? It's a mild worry, but by and large you can see that particularly in emerging states, and particularly the US presidential, some people would say not too much to worry about. But let me just focus on the UK for a minute, because I think this tells the more general story that you find in many other countries, particularly in Western Europe, but also beyond Western Europe. So if you look at the top line is the general election. So that's gone from roughly 80% in the 1960s and is now recording underneath 60%. So the top line, that's the most important election. That's the one that all the newspapers are interested in. Lost 20% of voter turnout over the course of the last 40 years. The next one, the next line down is by-elections. So this is where you have equivalent of a general election between general elections. An MP dies, you have to replace them, you have a by-election, voter turnout well in decline. Then you have the European and you have the local elections. If you look at the European election in particular, it only started at 30% and it's now headed towards 20%. There are constituencies in the UK where less than 10% of the voters turn out to vote in a European election. So 9 people out of 10 don't bother to turn up to vote. Then of those people who vote out of that 10%, the vote may be split 3 ways. So it may be that the winning candidate represents in direct terms 3% of the population of that constituency. Now, by any stretch of imagination, if you've got an MP standing up in the European Parliament saying, my people, my constituency, and he actually represents 3% of his own constituency, it's become a farce, actually, democracy. It's become a joke, and everyone should be concerned about that as a kind of basis for legitimation. Party membership, let's just switch to that a little bit. Here the story I think is much more dramatic. So elections, you can make up different stories about elections, but the story about political parties is pretty much catastrophic if you think that parties are the key actors in a healthy democratic culture. So if you look here, just some basic data, Uruguay, 30%, that's the top, that's the country with the most amount of political members in the world. And as you come down the picture, it gets worse and worse. Typically 10, 5%. Actually, the next slide does have Spain on it. You'll be very pleased to. So here is a similar graph, but it has Spain in the middle. So this is as of 2000, the year 2000. Party membership in Spain, you can see in the middle, is about 3.2%. I looked it up today. 3.2% of the Spanish population is a paying member of a political party. If you think how much grief you get from those political parties of yours, the PSOE, the PP, how much dominance, how much influence those two parties wield, and yet only 3 people out of 100 are members of those political parties. Look at the story in the UK. So 2%. Now, I know the UK story very well, of course. It's where I grew up, where most of my work has been done. In the 1960s, roughly 30% of the population in the UK was in a political party. 30%, 1 person in 3. Today, it's less than 2%. Absolute cataclysmic decline. Roughly Labour, Conservative, 5 million members in the 1960s. Today, it would be less than 400,000 between them. And many of those 400,000 are actually dead and have not been able to pull their subscription yet. Okay? Now, when I give these talks in Australia, they always think Australian democracy robustly healthy, fantastic, good standard of living, all doing very well, nice big cars. But look at the state of Australian democracy. Less than 1% of the Australian population is a member of a political party. I think that's pretty extraordinary. The voter statistics, of course, the Australians are much happier about. It's nearly 100%. Why? Because voting is compulsory in Australia. And if you don't vote, you get a $150 fine through the post in 3 weeks' time. So that's one way of solving democratic legitimation. You enforce it. You force it on people. As we move down those variables, thinking about the crisis, we also are interested in trust in politicians. Very important in a democracy, healthy democracy, flourishing democracy, we trust them. Have a look at the data from Australia in 2008, quite a big poll, Reader's Digest 1,000 people poll. At the top, the most trusted figures in Australia: ambulance officers, firefighters, pilots, nurses, pharmacists. Where do we find politicians? We keep going. Number 20, number 30, 31, 32 taxi drivers, 35 journalists, 36 real estate agents, sex workers come in at 37, car salesmen at 38, politicians at 39, with only telemarketeers, people selling you double glazing by the phone as the least trusted. So again, this is not an absolute, but it's a relative measure. All of these other professions are trusted more in Australia than politicians. And here's a bit more data. This is an Irish poll, trust survey from 2010, quite a big trust survey, 10,000 respondents here. Again, something very similar. Who do you trust to tell the truth, the vérité, about the nature of the world? Doctors on top, professors second. Yeah, Ramon, we are trusted. Teachers, judges, and on we go. And then who's right at the bottom there? Politicians generally, 17% of people trust politicians. That's pretty catastrophic. World Economic Forum and Trust, it's more of the same. So this is trust index by country. Spain's not on here, but if you look at the, basically you've got a very odd assortment of countries near the top. And right at the bottom, countries like the United States, where politicians are not really trusted. Taiwan, Azerbaijan, even Germany, right down there at the bottom. So we're very skeptical. I don't want to dwell on the data because it just shows us some quite interesting facts. I just hope that gives you a little bit of an insight. Let's open up the main slide again. Okay, let's get back on this one. When we're measuring interest in parliamentary affairs, there are various ways you can do that fairly objectively. The most important one that I've seen is the coverage in the serious newspapers of parliamentary news. So the Times of London in the 1960s used to have 7 or 8 pages every day reporting what was going on in Parliament. How many today? It's 1/4 of a page on average reporting parliamentary politics. So our interest in parliamentary affairs is seriously in decline. When I gave a talk like this in a big bar in Australia, so I was invited to give a talk, and it was called Nerd Night. A nerd is like a professor, glasses, you know, only got. So these were all about 70 people in a bar, and I gave them 5 questions, simple questions about politics. I asked them, for example, who was the leader of the Green Party in Australia? Okay, it's the 3rd biggest party. Who's the leader? I asked them, who is the editor of the most important, the only national newspaper? What is the name of the Prime Minister's constituency? I had 70 people out there, and they were divided into teams of 4, and out of the 5 questions, only 1 table got 2 questions or more right. They were appalled themselves at their complete lack of knowledge. They thought they were interested in politics, but they knew nothing about it. And in my experience, that's quite typical. I'm always quizzing the students. They think they know about politics, but actually just very basic facts, which I think my parents and my grandparents would have known about their own political system, they don't know. That's not a very scientific way of going about things, but it was good fun in the pub that night to look at the faces of people. I don't know that, that's crazy. Okay, to me, it's not just about numbers. It's also about how we describe our relationship to the world and what it is that we hear in movements and in leaders that tells us that there is something going on here which only the numbers capture in a very particular way. The decline in the discourse of representation, how we think and talk about politics. Let me give you some examples here. The World Social Forum is probably the most important, or one of the most important global initiatives on the left in world politics in the last 13 years. Some of you here are members of ATTAC or associated with that. It was an initiative very much led by ATTAC with the Brazilian party, Workers' Party in Brazil, Lula da Silva, held in Porto Alegre. It set up a constitution. If you read that constitution, it's a very interesting document. One of the things it says is that we do not represent, and nor do we welcome representatives of political parties, trade unions, or other civil associations. So you are supposed to attend and participate at the World Social Forum as an individual, not as a representative of something. What they were trying to signal is we don't want politicians. And I was at quite a difficult session when we had two politicians come in. They were in suits at the World Social Forum. That means you're a politician, right? And the chairman actually said, who are you guys? And they said, we are from the Argentinian Socialist People's Party. He said, that's the wrong answer. You should have given your names and you should not mention the fact of your connection to what's going on. It denies that it represents and it denies representatives. That to me, it made me think when I came away from that. The second group there will be familiar to many in this room, the Zapatistas. If you look at the discourse of Subcomandante Marcos, who was a spokesperson for the Zapatistas, how he describes the relationship of the Zapatista army, the EZLN, to the indigenous of the Chiapas, is that he says, we came to lead those peasants to emancipation and to revolution. But very quickly we realized that they knew exactly what they wanted to do, and what they needed was our help, not our leadership. And from that moment on, we rejected the role of leadership in relation to the indigenous people. Marcos has been very much criticized by left parties for this stance. Why aren't you leading the revolution? Why aren't you showing the rest of the world how to build a new world? He got so fed up of this that in 2006 he wrote a pamphlet called I Shit on All the Revolutionary Vanguards of This Planet. I'm not in the revolutionary vanguard business. I'm in the listening business. Our project is dignidad, dignity, and respect. That's it. We don't have a manifesto, don't have a philosophy. We initiate govern obeying. We govern by obeying the 40 communities of the Chiapas. Those people know what they want, and if they don't know, they will argue for days and days and days, and then tell us what they want. Our job is not to represent them or to lead them. Right? Of course, many of you know bullet point 3 because you're involved in this. Emergence of street politics that resists the attempts at being represented and representing others. 15M, Occupy, Turkey, Brazil, it's all around us. We've asked, Ramon and I have asked many, many times, activists in 15M, Quintherme, why don't you have a political party of Quintherme? Quintherme cannot be represented. We cannot represent Quintherme. It's an unrepresentable thing. It is anger, passion, distrust. Find your own way within Quintherme, but don't ask us to create a political party, because the moment you do that, the moment you try to capture what it is that Quintherme is, you will lose half the people in Quintherme, straight away. The unrepresentable aspect is very important in understanding Occupy as a general phenomenon in the US, UK, Spain, everywhere. No political program. Where's your political program? Where's your manifesto? Where's your 10 points? Nada. Where's your leader? Where's your office? Where's your bureaucracy? Where's your candidates for elections? No. We're just going to sit here and occupy. And of course, it's partly, people read this phenomenon as it's a critique of capitalism, the 99% against the 1%. But I read it also facing the other way. It's also a critique of Leninism and the inheritance of left representative politics, which detaches itself from the street, from the people, creates a new intellectual caste, and then loses touch with the ordinary feelings of ordinary people. So it's also an anti-Leninist stance, as well as an anti-capitalist stance. A couple more just to kind of roll out a few ideas here for us to come back to. The emergence of unmediated, okay? Representative politics is mediated politics. It's a form of mediation. I don't know how to translate that in Spanish, but it's important. The emergence of unmediated, direct, autonomous styles of politics, hacking, boycotting, pinging, squatting, affinity groups, coalitions, alliances. Technically, we could call this molecular politics. And we are the molecules. What you hear a lot in activist discourse, particularly in Spain, I want to keep myself. I don't want myself to be represented by someone else. I want to be a participant, an actor. I want to take part. I want to count. I want my voice to be part of the movement. I don't want somebody thinking that they understand me and my concerns. So this is very much part of the kind of politics that many of you are engaged with. The popularity of theorists who say that we must turn away from representative politics. And I just throw this out because there are always activists who ask me, I want to read something, or who is it that we can go to in order to understand the present situation? We've got a bit of a musical accompaniment going on. Gives me a chance to have a drink. Hart and Negri, many activists read. Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, very important texts. John Holloway. The activists I know in the UK love John Holloway. He is an activist. He's very closely connected to Zapatistas. He wrote a beautiful book called Change the World Without Taking Power, which I think is a Tormey book. How do you change the world without taking power? A beautiful book. And a follow-up book called Crack Capitalism, the idea of anti-capitalism within the cracks of capitalism. David Graeber, quite an important anthropologist and writer about anarchism, anarchist politics. Deleuze and Guattari from the 1970s. Many activists like the concept of the rhizome, I guess it would be maybe in Spanish. The Situationists, the inheritance of French theorists from 1968, Guy Debord, Raoul van Eyck, again, a very good book, might be useful people here. The Revolution in Everyday Life by Raoul van Eyck. It's a beautiful book. Post-anarchism, we could carry on. I have taught lots of courses on these things, and there is a lot of very interesting texts about the discourse of the crisis of representation. So explanations in political science. These are where my political science colleagues go when they want to explain the crisis of representative politics. Colin Hay has written a very good book, I think, called Why We Hate Politics. And really the nub of his argument is this concept of depoliticisation, which he thinks is caused by new public management and neoliberalism. So one of the key factors here, contingent factor, is that our politicians have decided to give up the things which we wanted run by the public: water, electricity, education, health, housing. If you privatise all these things, or not privatise but make them subject to market competition and market controls, you depoliticise them. In other words, if you privatise water, that takes water from being a public thing and puts it as a private thing, and we don't argue about it anymore. We can't talk about whether we find the water charges fair or whether we want to develop water resources or other energy resources. You depoliticise by pushing everything out into the private sector. So Colin Hay and many others say that this is a cause of the crisis. We also have, of course, and this is I think maybe have a particular resonance in Spain, perhaps more so than in the UK, but the decadence of the political class. and in particular its corruption. So we've heard this over and over again in the 10 or so days that we've been talking to activists and ordinary people. The degree of mistrust and contempt for the political class in Spain is boundless, it seems to me. That mere mention of the term politician and people, they absolutely do not. There's a huge task of rebuilding trust in this country after years, perhaps decades, of political corruption. It's a very serious problem. If you think your leaders are corrupt, what's your incentive to vote for more politicians or more parties or to stick with the old parties? Globalisation and denationalisation. So again, comes across quite strongly with activists that many of the jobs in Spain, in France, in Britain are the responsibility of overseas corporations. It might be Volkswagen, or it might be Ralph Lauren, or it might be Coca-Cola. The more globalized, the more integrated our economies into the international, the less sense of control and the less sense of affinity we have with those industries. And of course, we know that if in Catalonia makes a big fuss about politics and economics, the Volkswagen might just say, we've had enough of this. We're going to Czechoslovakia, those people are a bit quieter, or we're going to China, or we're going to Thailand. We know that this is part of our new political lives, that we are part of a global economy, part of a European economy, and that therefore the choices we make have to be made with reference to a whole series of very unseen interests. And again, the feeling is that this set of processes empties or denudes politics of its content. We're too fearful to act because we might upset a transnational corporation. And of course, there are many sociologists who point to changing patterns in our lives. People, it seems, are much less political. They spend more time shopping. They spend more time on their individual activities. They spend more time watching sport, or being on the internet. There are many more distractions in our individual lives, and this, according to people like Bauman, Robert Putnam and so on, creates a kind of atmosphere where we care less about the public realm. We care less about politics because as long as we're okay, then we don't have to worry about everyone else. But I think there's something much, not just contingent, but there are evolutionary factors here. So to me, there are some deeper lying trends in modernity which are having a very important impact on the nature of politics. And I'll go through these quite quickly because many of you will know these factors already. Disruption of patterns of authority and identity, quite well documented in sociological literatures, that the contemporary subject questions more, is less inclined to follow authority, whether that authority be of the church, or whether it be of the state, or whether it be of schoolmasters, or whether it be of parents. We have individualized ourselves to the degree that all sources of authority have to have their own justification. We don't take well to being told what to do by other people. We don't take easily to hierarchy. And to me, that's a good thing, but it also creates some ripples in the political pond. Transnationalism. Well, I mean, many of you have got life stories here which should tell us a little bit about what's going on. I was born in Ireland. My parents left to go to Britain because there were no jobs in Ireland. I married a French woman. Our children were born in England of a French and Irish, and we now live in Australia. To which place do they owe identity or loyalty? Where do they feel at home? Where is their sense of collective? Well, they don't have it. If you listen to my children, tomorrow they could live in France, or they could live in Latin America, or they could live in New York. They're what we might call global nomads. Now, that's the rich end of the transnational story. There's also the less rich end of the transnational story because, of course, many people have been forced to move because of human rights abuses, lack of work, nothing to do. But of course, we're in the middle of a revolution in transnational terms. A place like Sydney, those of you who've been to these big mega cities, New York, London, I haven't been to Madrid, so I won't comment, but Paris, Sydney, I mean, the sheer mix of nationalities, of different identities, of hybrid identities. So some of my favourite students are Australian Chinese students, second generation. And you say, well, what about the next election? They couldn't care less. I could be in Beijing, I could be in Sydney, I could be in London. They don't have that sense of place and home and identity anymore. Post-Fordism and precarious labour. Well, I don't need to labour the point in Spain because you're at the cutting edge of a major shift, a major revolution in terms of industry and the economy, that we are moving away from 40-year jobs where we start aged 18 or 20, we stay there all our lives, we owe a debt, a loyalty to that company, and then we retire. Well, that model, finito. We now move or mobile. If we're not mobile, then we take precarious labour, shift jobs, shift universities, shift enterprises. It's a much more complex tapestry than before. And of course, this is having an impact on the idea of the working class as being a class which has a strong sense of its own self-identity. It's much less so. Much less of a strong sense of self-identity. I went to university in Wales, and I remember the miners' strike in Wales, and that solidarity of those people who grew up in the same village, went to the same mine, had been in the Labour Party all their lives, that was rock solid. Yeah? But their children have had to move away. The mine's closed, no more jobs, moved to Cardiff, moved to London. It's much more difficult. Individualisation, we can talk about that. It's a complex concept. Those of you who came to hear Zygmunt Bauman, he is the great philosopher of individualisation, and he tells us that many of these changes can be summarised in terms of the loss of collective identities, the loss of our sense of being part of something greater than ourselves. We are now ourselves. I think, well, again, we can have an argument about that. To me, it's a gain. For him, it's a loss. The exhaustion of meta-narratives is a phrase from Jean-François Lyotard. And the idea there is that, of course, with this changing fabric of politics, we lose the sense of an emancipatory project. The big projects of the 19th century, socialism, communism, anarchism, certainty about what that future life looks like. We didn't meet any activists who were certain about what the world was that they wanted to build. They knew much more about what they didn't want than what they do want. They knew much more about the problems that surround them and much less confidence that there was a single blueprint for a kind of world which would resolve all these problems. We didn't meet anyone. We met hundreds of activists, and none of them said, Simon, I've got the answer for you, and it looks like this, okay? That kind of faith in the emancipatory project is gone. Of course, what can we say? I mean, this is a huge topic, the emergence of new technological capacities that shift organizational life towards networks and away from fixed hierarchies. This is so important. You guys in the audience know this much better than I do. Would you have Tormey without Facebook and without Twitter and without the ridiculous ease of interacting with others? How would you do that? How would you have a street protest, street demonstrations? How would you be able to interact with different groups between PA and Yayos Flautas and other groupings without these processes of technology? It was much harder 20 or 30 years ago. Of course, some people had the energy to do that, but now it's so much easier. And we see this over and again. In Turkey, that's not a big planned, that's a lot of people going, meet you in the square. Get down to the square, we're pissed off. Right, let's go. Brazil, I mean, there's not a political party behind that. There's a lot of folks getting Twitter, see you here, let's go. Right, boom. Ridiculously easy to create initiatives and events. still hard to maintain them. And we'll come to that. So easy to start up, easy to disappear, right? Then you guys, it's much harder to maintain and to grow and to improve initiatives. So what's going on? So we move, I think, from representative to anti, non, and post-representative politics. So in our minds, if we're thinking about what representative politics looks like, we have a very firm image in our minds. We join the political party has a manifesto or a program, we vote for that political party, the political party wins power in Parliament, and it enacts the policies that it's supposed to enact because it was elected. Well, that image, that form of politics has been disrupted by what we see around us today. And of course, these are the items that I've been very interested in talking to activists in Spain about. So many of you here have contributed to my own understanding of this, and I thank you for that, and I hope that I haven't misrepresented what I think are the really significant and interesting developments going on in Spain. So, of course, assemblies and direct styles of politics. So it starts, or not starts, but of course the most vigorous inspiration for 15M, for Tormey, is this, the occupations, which then lead to the assemblies. And of course what is an assembly? An assembly is a disaggregated mass of people who are not in a same political party, but who want to come together in order to achieve something. And then the complexity starts. What is the thing that we want to achieve together? We can just occupy the space, that'll do something, but then we've got to try and come up with some idea of what it is that we share, what's going to unite us, what's going to put some pressure on. And of course, many of you took part in these assemblies. And we saw in Castellón the assembly of 15M in action, trying to create a sense of solidarity and collective initiative based on a direct, deliberative, no politicians, there's no leader. You have people who are very articulate, people who say a lot, but they're not in bureaucratic positions of leading. We have flash initiatives. So there are many of these kinds of things where you see an opportunity to protest against a politician or a trade union or a town hall or a particular kind of protest. So I think coming up, is it tomorrow there's going to be, or maybe Friday, a protest against fracking? Saturday, so 60 buses coming to Castellón, everyone should be there, against fracking. So an initiative goes up on Facebook, it tries to unite the various people who are interested in ecological politics, and they come together, and they come together for this particular initiative, but then they also try to develop momentum behind ecological politics more generally. Pop-up parties. In England, we talk about pop-up shops. So all the old shops are like closed, so the old chains. So what happens is that somebody comes along and they ask the landlord if they can use the shop for 2 weeks. And they gather up a lot of stuff from China and they take over the shop and then they just try and sell as much stuff as they can in 2 weeks. And then it closes again. So we've got pop-up shops, but I think we've got pop-up parties as well. So you've got parties which pop up, okay? So you've got 4 or 5 people who go, we need to organise in order to campaign for a change in the electoral law. Right, okay, let's do it. Nothing else, let's just concentrate on that. Or we want to campaign for a constituent assembly. Just that, focus on that. Or we want, it pops up, have they got traction? Have they got durability? Well, you see, but some of them have and some of them haven't. But the number of political parties that we've been told about in the last couple of weeks, I mean, we lost count of them. I tried to write them all down. I mean, they're just every day. There was, oh, but we're also setting up a political party. Or, have you heard of this political party in Andalusia? Have you heard of this political? No, no, no. Write them down, write them down. Party, 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 party. Lots of them. And some of them will die straight away. And some of them might flourish and go on and become something. and do something. But they're not the same as established parties, right? They're not the same as the Socialist Party and the People's Party. They've been there for decades and decades and decades. And the guys wear identical suits, identical ties. They sound the same. They say we. They don't say I think. They say we. You know, they use a politician's discourse and rhetoric. Very different discourse. And of course, there are single-issue and quasi-parties. Quasi, maybe they're parties, maybe they're not. One day they look a bit like movements, then the next day they look a bit like parties. And it's quite difficult, depending on who you're talking to get the right kind of thing here. So we have colleagues in here from some of these, the Escanos en Blanco. It's got three big things: internet and censorship, human rights, and a desire for direct democracy. What do you think about health? Don't know. Come back in a few months. What do you think about schools? Not our business. We'll sort that out later on. We're interested. It's not what I'm calling 360-degree parties. The Socialist Party's got a view on everything, right? Schools, roads, housing, Europe, international relations, blah, blah, blah. Not these guys. We care about these three things, right? And everything else we'll get to when we've got the time, okay? The Pirata, again, just, we want to do these things, yeah? Sorry, I've got them mixed up. Pirata is the internet, human rights, direct democracy. Escanos en Blanco is white seats party, as we know. So vote for us, and we'll send a strong message to politicians, because when nobody takes that seat, they'll get the message that they're all bastards, which would be a good thing, right? What do you think about education? No, we're not thinking about that, okay? So other kind of things. So also we met networks of the like-minded. So ATTAC, even 15M is really a network rather than, it certainly doesn't have any political party features. DRI, of course, is a kind of a network. Some people said, well, let's make a political party out of it. Other people said, no, forget it. It's not that kind of organization. So we call it a network. Then we've got other kinds of things, the parties without politicians. So we had a long discussion with the Partido del Futuro yesterday in Valencia. Very interesting discussion. It's a very different kind of party, this. There aren't going to be any politicians. Are you going to have a manifesto? No manifesto. Are you going to have a program? No program. What are you going to do? We're going to make a referendum on the future of the Spanish political system. And who's going to make that argument? We don't know yet. We don't know if we're going to have politicians yet. It's a bit scary, the thought of politicians. I love it. Parties without politicians. Why not? Will it work? We don't know. Everybody in the room uses the concept of a political tool. I've heard that so many times every day. A political tool. Whether it be a network or a movement or a party with or without politicians, everybody is in the same creative laboratory of asking themselves what will work with the Spanish people. What will get them motivated? What will provoke change? What will help us transform? Without ceding our voice and our energy to some politician or other. Movement or street parties. Now, those of you who are English-speaking, street party actually has a different connotation. A street party is long tables, lots of drinks, big fun, okay? It's got that double aspect to it. So, but street party, I mean, Coop, we met Coop several times, very interesting people. We're a party, but we're really a movement. And they've drunken deep from the same juice as the Zapatistas. And they say that we don't lead, or we don't represent, you represent yourselves to us. And then we will have a loop, feedback loop from the street to the party, from the party to the street. And we won't give up our street credibility, as you would say in English. And of course, I've thrown in here Pepe Grillo's party, the Movimiento, the Chank, I can't remember the brain's gone a bit dead. Didn't have my siesta this afternoon. The Five-Star Party, as we would say in English, which is a movement which also contested elections. And I don't think they imagined that they would win many seats, right? So it wouldn't be a problem that you didn't have a manifesto or a program. Hey, but crap, they one whole heaps of... Then what do we do? I don't know. I mean, Beppe Grillo, okay. You know, he's on the phone. What do we stand for? I don't know. Tell them something about nuclear energy and withdrawing from Europe. Okay, whatever. So a lot of experimentation. Anti-political figures with significant political influence. So I think I've heard this again many times recently. One of the most popular figures in Spain is popular because she's not a politician, but she's a very articulate spokesperson for some of the poorest people in society who are suffering at the hands of the current regime, Ada Colau. And a lot of people say, why doesn't she stand in an election? But of course, what might then happen, of course, is that she loses her credibility, she begins to sound like a politician, and everyone goes, Ada Colau, she's just like everyone else. Okay? There's always the danger with these kind of figures. Beppe Grillo, of course, did not stand himself for election, and he wanted to keep out of the electoral process in order to maintain, I think, his own sense of not being a politician, but being someone who had a view and a voice and who connected with ordinary Italians. So he made that gesture of not seeking office himself, but having a movement which, in a sense, did it himself. So these are very interesting. So how do we make sense of all this? What are the general characteristics of what's going on around us here? And I'm conscious of time. Can I have 10 minutes? Is that all right? So we're moving away from regular, mediated, slow, predictable politics of the politicians, which is what representative politics is about, with a very limited number of actors. So this style, form of politics, what I would call a paradigm of politics, I see in terminal decline. I think the days of maintaining this pyramid-style representative politics are over, and we'll only be able to verify that with time, but I think it's something that my political science colleagues are very resistant to. They think that we're going through a very temporary hiatus in politics. I don't think it's temporary. I don't think what we're seeing is just in response to an economic crisis or to the particular. I think we're in a longer-term pattern of change here. And I think we're moving toward, and these concepts are concepts I've developed whilst I've been here talking to Ramon, talking to activists. I've not nailed them down. You're the first to hear about some of these concepts, but I'm going to try you out on some of them, see what you think. I keep coming back to the word evanescent. I don't know how well that translates. It's got, you can see it in Spanish there, evanescente, Depoliticisation. Evanescent style of politics. It's fluid, it's dynamic, experimental, and highly contingent. It's like a laboratory out there. People putting one juice with another juice and seeing if that creates something, okay? It's not with a huge amount of deliberation, or sometimes it's a huge amount of deliberation, but it's very much in the form of it comes and it goes. The assemblies, they come and they go. This party pops up, it goes. Evanescence. We have to get used to this new kind of style and forms of politics. The aim of many initiatives is less to attract votes. This is something I'm really thinking a lot about. Before I sit down and try and work this out on paper, I'm really trying to think this in my sleep here. The aim of many initiatives is less to attract votes than to resonate and amplify the concerns of those involved. So the vote is one kind of substance that's interesting to many political initiatives. But really the point is resonance. I just had a conversation with a comrade outside. You'll all know him. He's one of the guys of the assembly of 15M in the square in Castillon. And he said, I'm a bit depressed. We don't seem to have an effect. I said, well, many of these effects are completely unseen. We're not dealing with a linear form of causality here. But where did Turkish people get the idea of occupying a square from? Where did the Brazilians get the idea of just pouring out into the streets in great numbers from? Ramon tells me today on the news, some of them are calling themselves indignados. I mean, that's resonance, okay? People are watching each other. They watch the news, they're watching you guys. I can tell you that, that many activists in the UK, they know far more about 15M than I do. Why? Because it resonates. They see and they hear and they go, yes, that's what we are worried about as well. That's what we're anxious about. That's the style of politics we're grappling from. And it ripples around the world, this, because it happens in a microsecond. That's what the internet does. It allows us to see into the modes and cultures and anxieties and fears of people all over the world, and to imitate and to mimic and to try out things which seem to resonate. So it's not copying, because every culture, every country has its own particular characteristics, but it's amplification of particular concerns, and we're going to see a lot more of this. Elections are losing their privileged place in favour of it's a very ungainly term in English, clamour. The effort to create enough noise or resonance to produce change through tipping points. So again, those of you who, politicians don't listen. They bloody well are listening. I know politicians. In my very privileged position, I meet a lot of politicians. They read the newspapers. They see the TV. There was a very intelligent reaction to the Brazilian demonstrations, those of you who are following the events in Brazil, where Cardoso and Lula da Silva said, if you don't listen to the street, you'll be swept out of power by the end of the week. You'll be dead in the water. So, Mr. President, and they were, they're ex-presidents themselves. If you don't listen to these people, and if you don't make positive gestures, you've had it. You'll be toast. And of course, the Turkish calculation is the other way around. If we can crush this, if we can smash it, we'll be able to restore order. Well, the jury's out in Turkey at the moment, because it's just changed again, the Turkish protest. So now they cleared the square. Yeah, they managed to do that, smashed it all up, arrested thousands of people. So now a guy comes along, if you're watching the news today, it's fascinating, and he just stands still in the middle of the square. I'm not doing it, I'm just going to stand still. And people wandering around, well, what's this guy doing? Within 40, 50 minutes on Twitter, people are saying there's a guy just stood still in Taksim Square. Well, let's go have a look. Well, okay, let's stand next to him. Stand. There are now thousands of people standing still in squares all over Turkey. And the challenge is, right, now what are you going to do with this? Okay, police. Standing still, doing nothing. Nothing at all. No slogan, no protest, no megaphone. Try this, okay? Try this new tool, new way of, Does it resonate? Does it create noise? Does it create a tipping point? Interesting. How long has Erdogan got? We'll see. It's all the laboratory of insurrection, this, right? That's where we are at. Yesterday, we thought of a new concept. This political environment here resembles a mushroom field, okay? I go to bed, I wake up, there's a shitload of new political parties in Spain again, right? Or in Turkey or elsewhere. Versus an orchard, okay, we've got to have something else to go, slow versus quick, evanescent versus traditional. That's what we're interested in. Okay, what does it mean for democracy? Last 3 minutes, very quick points here. They're not complicated points. But what I would like to draw your attention to is that many of my colleagues in political science describe the current phase. They follow Colin Crouch's book, and they describe it as post-democracy. Why? Because politics has died. Don't you know that politics has died? Fewer people are turning up for elections. They're not joining political parties, and therefore politics is finished, right? Hold on a second. Are they watching the friggin' news? Do they follow what's going on in front of their noses? Okay? And they draw the conclusion there are many books on this apathetic people, the detached people, the indifferent people. Yeah, sure, there are many, apathetic, detached, indifferent people. But there are many other people who are very angry and very motivated and very pumped to produce change. So it may be that the opposite is true. The reconfiguration of democracy along new post-representative lines. This is not my phrase, but it's a phrase that you find in one of your old friends here in Castillon, John Keane, in his masterwork, Life and Death of Democracy. He uses the phrase post-democracy to describe monetary democracy, and also Pierre Rosanvallon in Paris uses the term counter-democracy. And I throw in Jacques Rancière there because I think his description of democracy is very post-representative in the way in which we're talking about these things as well. And Rancière reminds us that democracy is the rule of everyone and anyone. The demos in ancient Greece didn't mean a small number of people selected by birth. It didn't mean the very wealthiest. It meant anyone and everyone. So the key democratic characteristic of Athens was not the assembly. That's not what made it democratic. The key aspect of democracy in Athens was rotation by lot. When you have a vacancy on a committee, they put all the names in and they drew out the name of any citizen. Anyone can rule. And that was their safeguard against tyranny and oligarchy, was that everybody in the room will come to be a ruler. That's what democracy actually meant. And Rancière tells us, the way he describes it is that we have convinced ourselves over the last 2 centuries that democracy is not rule of everyone and anyone, it's rule by the best. It's aristocracy. We've been living in aristocracy, but not in democracy. So the final point of my talk here is that in recuperating the desire to act, as opposed to mandating others to act, in other words, by rejecting representation and being represented, which is a kind of capture of our desire, we reaffirm democracy as a popular in that technical sense, a popular system of government as opposed to an elective oligarchy. And of course, the future holds is what the balance between that popular element is, the return of the people, as it were, as a factor in political life versus the politicians. But it's people like you guys in this room who have reawakened and reminded us of what democracy actually must be, not just today, but for tomorrow. Ruled by everyone and anyone. And at that point, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Bien, tenemos tiempo para preguntas, cuestiones, para un pequeño debate. Tenemos tiempo, ¿no? Micro. Se puede hacer también en español y Ramón se encarga de traducir. Sí. A ver, ahí debajo está Ramón.
Simon, good evening. I have a question regarding communication. For me, one of the causes of the lack of representation of people feeling very angry is the fact that politicians talk to each other. They don't talk to their voters. In Spain, particularly, we see Rajoy and Rubalcaba. It's as if they're having a conversation every press conference, but we do not see our politicians talking to the people. So we've sort of resigned from them. We want them to resign, but we've resigned from them. Mm-hmm. My question is, what role do you think the mass media are having regarding these press conferences, which are no longer really press conferences, and how can that influence what is happening in all this? Basically, mass media and politicians not talking to their voters.
Well, I mean, it's a very important question. I don't think I probably didn't speak enough about the media because obviously if we're talking about mediation, which was one of the things I was talking about, how do people learn about politics and how do politicians learn about the feelings of, well, the media is very, very important. I mean, it seems to me that we're in the grip of a kind of revolution as far as the media is concerned. Many of the old media and many of our ways of interacting with the old media are clearly dying out. And the days of sitting for hours reading one of the standard broadsheet newspapers is very fast receding. But that creates then a vacuum, and I think we're still in thrall to the kind of official media. And I think one of the most interesting developments is obviously the potential of the movements themselves to generate media and to use social technologies in a very creative way in order to create alter media and new media, and the emphasis on filming things and obviously on interviews and using an elaborate repertoire of media devices is clearly very key to maintaining the energy and enthusiasm of participants. But I think it's also a very important thing, and I don't, you know, it's interesting because we're at this kind of moment in history when I think politicians themselves, they actually will have to respond. They will have to react. And of course, they're trying not to. And they're trying to keep the conversation very closed, and they're using a language which is very closed, and they use a rhetoric of we think and we the people discursively, which is increasingly turning people off. And I think unless they break out of their metropolitan shell, that they will reap the consequences of that. I mean, we've spoken to, obviously to a lot of activists, but we've spoken to some pretty ordinary people as well. I mean, no one has got a positive word to say about politicians in Spain, right? And sooner or later, this expresses itself. If the electoral system is so blocked that people feel that it doesn't reflect their needs, their interests, their desires, then they will go around that electoral system and they will cause more chaos and they will more demands coming from all over the place. So I think either the politicians kind of wake up, smell the coffee and begin to learn to adapt and to respond, or you probably will have a cycle of political crisis leading to God knows what. I mean, one doesn't want to be, I'm an optimist as you can tell, but I think Spain has this very particular problem of this electoral system which almost guarantees the representation of these old, tired, clapped out political parties. And clearly something has got to give in that, otherwise they will just keep talking amongst themselves. So it's a very, very important question. But I think the media itself is changing. It's not just big newspapers, it's also a vast array of online, internet, all sorts of different resources.
I have a very, very brief question because on the other hand, I have to say that I have to leave right now, but it's really urgent.
Okay.
I was lacking one word in your presentation, and that is power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we talk about representation, I'm totally with you, and that we have new ways of democracy and everything. But the problem, at least, since the last elections here in Spain, when 15M was already existing here and on the streets and very, very big, was the crisis of representation, what you just said, of the elections, and what happened afterwards. I mean, all the cut-downs. And I mean, we are now, we may have the power as people, but we don't have money anymore. I mean, except for some people who are richer than before. So I mean, what happened in the last 1.5 years, it's so dramatic, and it will be more dramatic even. So if you stand still, I find it a really brilliant thing, but if you stand still in Turkey or here, you may have an impact, but do you have power? And that would be my question for you. What do you think about the gap between, you know, the impact you can have on the media, on the internet, or for others, and the real power in terms of a change of politics? Thank you.
Well, here's a story that my colleagues at Sydney absolutely love, so I'll tell it here. I never thought about it until I told one of my colleagues, but my first job as a university lecturer was, I was appointed in May 1989 to be lecturer in communist politics. My PhD was on communist politics, on the Soviet Union. And my living depended on the maintenance of the Soviet Union and East Germany. 1 month after being nominated to that tenured position, fortunately it was tenured, the whole thing collapses. And all of my lectures were about how the Soviet Union had evolved a consensual style of politics, that they'd managed to listen to people, and therefore the prospect of a fundamental collapse in this system of power, absolutely impossible. Well, I mean, 1 month after starting my job, the kind of job title had to be recomposed. The power of the powerless, the power of ordinary people, is an immensely difficult topic to weigh and quantify. The power of the politicians is easy. If you get 51% of the votes in the House or in the Senate, depending on the political system, you can do stuff, right? It's really easy to see. And that's why political scientists concentrate on the visible, official, mainstream political process. There's hardly any political scientists who study the power of the powerless. John Keane, actually, is one of the very few. I was very much inspired by his work. He was interested in Eastern and Central European politics. But how do you access it? A very brilliant essay by Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless. Look it up. Havel spent years in prison, years being hounded, years being arrested. What happens to Havel? He was made the president of the new Czech Republic by the powerless because he was not a politician, because he didn't want to do the job, because he had not the faintest intimation of using power in the way that politicians use power. So how do we understand the power of the powerless? Generally speaking, I would refer you to an anthropologist called James Scott, who's written many brilliant books, Domination and the Art of Resistance, about how ordinary people, how very powerless people, particularly peasant people in Southeast Asia, which is the topic, how all of a sudden they can create major changes. And it's never by creating political parties. It's always by highly subversive, highly hidden acts of subversion, which bit by bit, and like little ants against the elephant, create a hiatus and a storm around the actual system of power itself, which makes the system topple over. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in Spain, but I'm saying that often the most momentous things happen out of the most unpromising environments, like Eastern Europe or Central Europe or the Soviet Union, or today in Turkey or in Brazil or countless other regimes and spaces. How is it done? Well, it's done in a very, very insidious ways, in forms of networking, in highly kind of imaginative and creative styles of usually non-cooperation with authorities and if people just stopped doing things like, I don't know, paying a tax or something like that, I mean, boom, system comes tumbling down. But it's highly contextual. What works for peasants in Southeast Asia is not going to work for, mature democracies like Spain. But what I detect and what I take, amazing inspiration from is the desire to experiment and to be creative and to try things out and to use new political tools. Because one of these political tools or several of these political tools will have effects and they will change minds and they will be transformative. And you will get to where you want to be. As you can see, I'm an optimist. But it won't be the obvious linear, let's capture power. That whole way of thinking, I think, is quite tired, actually. Yeah.
She's wondering, what is your personal opinion on escaños en blanco?
Well, I think it's a bit like the card player. Or not the card player, the roulette player. It's much better. What's roulette in Spanish?
Ruleta.
Right. Roulette. My strategy in roulette is to have some money on that number, on this number, on that number, on this number. I try to minimize my kind of risk. I think escaños en blanco is, to me, it's like, let's get all the chips and put them on that square, right? Right, roll the dice and let's see if that hits bingo, okay? Because if it does, it will create a really big effect. And if it doesn't, you'll say, oh, well, let's try something else, okay? So there are much more conservative strategies about building and networking and so on. And I think your calculation is that actually, let's go for the very biggest symbolic gesture, which is the empty seat in Parliament. And let's try that out. And I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm delighted that someone's trying that out. But I also know that there are 138 other kinds of experiment of a kind of similar kind. And so, but I suppose the question back to you guys is, we met a lot of people who wanted to concentrate on the reform of the electoral law, or who wanted a constituent assembly. And I think there may certainly be room for some discussion between those of you who feel that is the place to go, to solidify your efforts, so that what you don't want happening is that you've got 5 or 6 parties who all got slight differences between them, and that splits your vote. I think, you know, there's room for more dialogue, more conversation between that particular group who share that strategy.
La traducimos de forma resumida, ¿no? Bueno, ha hecho una, no sé si metáfora, una comparación con una ruleta, ¿no? Y que hay diferentes estrategias, hay gente que pone las fichas en diferentes partes de la ruleta, sin embargo, Consent Blank lo que hace es coger todas las fichas y apostar por un número, ¿no? Y se centra muy claramente en ese aspecto, soltándolo a ver qué sucede, ¿no? A ver si consiguiendo el hecho no solo simbólico, sino también la fuerza de dejar un asiento en blanco en el Parlamento, qué efecto eso puede llegar a tener, ¿no? Y dice que eso es una estrategia, entre otras muchas que ha estado escuchando estos días, interesante y muy provocadora, ¿no? En ese aspecto. Lo que dice también, por otro lado, que el reto que os queda, o el reto que quedaría un poco en escaños en blanco, perdón, es que cuando hemos estado hablando con diferentes grupos, prácticamente todos los que iban a participar o pensaban dar el paso hacia crear un partido político, también hablaban del tema de la ley electoral, cambio, o sea, presionar a los partidos políticos desde dentro. Entonces, aspectos muy, muy cercanos a lo que vosotros estáis planteando. Dice, el reto que se plantea es, si esos 4 o 5 grupos llegan a presentarse a elecciones, claro, hay un peligro de que se dividan muchos pequeños votos que a la vez no lleve a esta ruleta a funcionar tal como podría ser, ¿no? Entonces, que queda ese reto abierto, plantea un poco. Ahora.
Hello, hi. Well, I have a question about, what's your opinion about, let me explain. We have here the problem of electoral control, the electoral voting. We are listening it a lot, but I think it's, I think in that moment, it's possible too that it can affect to, in a globalized world, and not only in a country, an electoral system. Mm-hmm. So because of the movements that are growing up in all around the world, I think, do you think it is possible that people grow, well, ¿cómo decirlo?
Mm-hmm. Vale. If I understood well what he was saying, okay. I mean, he is wondering why there is no a global common project of trying to change the whole system altogether, like a whole structure and all. But it was not through a political party, if I understood well. It's just as a... I
think here we want to change electoral system, for example, in Turkey want to change their political system too. I think it is possible that thanks to media, internet, similar, can grow a movement that wants to share all this around the world. Can be possible.
Well, I mean, I think there are global initiatives. So World Social Forum, I went to 3 of those, and I think it was very successful for a while, and then people sort of want to move on from that. I think there have been global initiatives. I mean, ATTAC, I think, has a kind of global footprint. And we've had People's Global Assembly, PGA. There have been kind of global fora and global initiatives and global networks and so on. Why doesn't everyone rise up against its own electoral system? I think because in some parts of the world, the electoral system's not the problem. So you're not going to get the Australian people rising up against the electoral system. Why not? Because In a sense, that's not the problem. The problem in Australia is potentially domination by China of its resources. Actually, that's going to be the one thing that's going to create agitation in the country I live in now, is the fact that in the good times in China, Australia does very well. When China has its next economic hiccup, Australia is going to really suffer because it's hugely over-leveraged, to use the technical term. What are the problems in a country like UK? Is it the electoral system? Are people going to get agitated about it? I don't think so, okay? So electoral systems differ wildly, as we know, across the world. I mean, in China, are they going to rise up about the electoral system? Well, I don't see, it's really, in China, it's about, the kind of protests you see is against expropriation of land, peasant revolts, environmental revolts, revolts against corruption of bribery and official. I think every country and every region and everywhere in the world has actually got its own kind of anxieties and its own fears. What you can do, of course, is to make common cause. So there's always points of affinity and points of connection. The Chinese are worried about corrupt officials. So are the Spanish worried about corrupt officials. So corruption and bureaucracy and the decadence of politicians, these are common themes that we need to tackle. But will that lead to a global movement? I don't think so, because I think the passions and energies are very different in different parts of the world.
Según la teoría política, ¿hay alguna alternativa práctica, real, que se pueda llevar a cabo de la democracia representativa? Simplemente es eso. Si hay alguna alternativa, porque por mucha crisis que haya de la democracia representativa, si la teoría nos dice que no hay ninguna otra posibilidad de gobierno que sea viable, pues no tiene sentido hacer nada. Bueno.
He always asks me the same question. What is the answer? Well, the nature of this project is really sociological, not normative, as we would say. So I'm trying to look at and capture the larger trends and tendencies of political life. And so what I've tried to switch off is my natural inclination as a philosopher to tell people how they should live, because it's not the nature of this particular project. And my own political sentiment is that democracy means people working through their own problems for themselves. So at the heart of democracy, there has to be uncertainty. And so therefore, to me, it's important as a philosopher not to have a blueprint or a model or a way of life which I can get out of my pocket and say, hey, Spain, if you only live like this, you'd all be much better off. To me, the point of democracy is to allow you guys, from the bottom up, to determine your own future and to have a political system which much more nearly reflects the diversity, the plurality, the fears and the hopes of the population. So at heart, I haven't really got an answer to that because I'm a Democrat. If I wasn't a Democrat, then I'd have an answer. And I know that sounds like a paradox. Maybe you can explain that in Spanish, that paradox. But to me, democracy is people deciding and determining for themselves how they want to live. So I am actually very much in favour of the constituent assembly process. I think that's very important coming in this post-transition period in Spain. That clearly there's a hunger and a determination on behalf of a lot of people in Spain to say, we had dictatorship here, then we had the transition, and now we want real democracy. And to determine how that's going to work will require a big, deliberative conversation amongst the Spanish about the nature of the political system they're going to erect. Does it need translating? I don't know.
Sí, bueno, la idea principal, así de forma muy resumida, es dice que no tiene una respuesta para ello. Es decir, hay un modelo alternativo que se pueda plantear a lo que decías, ¿no? La democracia representativa, viendo los problemas que tiene. Él dice que precisamente porque se defiende como demócrata, no pretende mostrar a nadie, ni es su objetivo dibujar el camino futuro de españoles o España o un país concreto. Por ahí deben de ir los tiros. Él considera que los procesos es importante, ¿no? Y también ha hecho mención a al contexto actual en España y al periodo de transición, ¿no? Una idea que se repetía mucho en los encuentros que ha tenido es la idea de la Asamblea Constituyente. Y ahí sí que él ve como eso que tú mismo planteas es una cuestión clave. O sea, es lo que se debe de plantear, hacia dónde puede ir el modelo de democracia definido, ¿no? Desde las estructuras básicas.
¿Y una, por si acaso? ¿Tenemos tiempo?
Sí, hombre, tú dirás.
No, it's a simple question. We in Castellón we try to work in the democratic innovation, but for that reason I think if the crisis of representation, of the crisis of electoral representation, is not the same. We can think in one kind of democratic representation that is not electoral representation.
I think the problem goes deeper than that. And I think the evolutionary trends, to me, point towards styles and forms of politics and people want to be engaged with where they feel that they're not being represented, but they're being a participant. And of course, the Pirata might translate that and say, well, why not direct democracy? And that's kind of a logical conclusion. But what we see, even in those people who say, well, what we need is a new political party, is they're not thinking about the political party as a representative structure with an oligarchy of people who basically enact the same style of politics as you get in the PP and the PSOE. Nearly everyone we spoke to who wanted a political party still imagined that that political party would be highly participatory. And what is that telling us? It's telling us that people who are active, people who care about politics, actually want to be actors themselves. They don't want somebody to speak for them. They want themselves to be part of that process. So the trick that everyone is trying to capture is how do you create an effective political tool which has a sharp tip so that people know what it's about, they know what that initiative is, they know what it's for, at the same time as they don't lose the energy of activists who say, my voice counts, I count, I don't want to be represented, I want to be... And of course, how this translates is that many activists see direct action as the embodiment of that particular desire. So if you're in Yayos Flautas, if you're in the PAO, you think, well, I'm making a difference, right? I'm doing the demonstrating. I'm helping the guy who's being thrown out of his house. It's a very direct, unmediated desire. But even those people who want to create political parties, they still manifest that same desire to want to count and not to just listen to a politician and, okay, you get my vote and now I go back and watch the TV. That's not... I think that model is problematic. I think it's not dead. And of course, I'm conscious, the other thing we should say, is that we've spent a lot of time speaking to activists. But activists are not everyone, right? And that's the other part of the equation that we're all kind of puzzling about is what about ordinary Spaniards, as it were? What about the people who are not in the square, who weren't part of Quinterme? What is their presentiment? Have they given up on politics? Or are they waiting for some other kind of way in which they can make their voice heard? I think these are the very interesting questions today in Spain.
Yeah. Bueno, si no, voy a resumo o no, una pregunta.
I would like to know if you think that this crisis of representation that you have talked about here mainly is concerned with political parties and governments. Do you think from your experience and from your talks these days or in the countries and other talks you have had, do you think we can see that crisis of representation in other kinds of institutions, like, for example, university?
Yeah, everywhere.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. I told Ramon this story. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm Irish, so I tell a lot of stories. It's in our Celtic blood. But I told Ramon this story yesterday, I must tell you, is that we had a big assembly, because we have a crisis at Sydney University. It's a bit like Spain, really. It's kind of, complicated place. And the Vice-Chancellor gave a big speech to all the faculty, and he was saying, if you've got any problems, please talk to your deans, your representatives on the University Council. And one of my colleagues gets up and he goes, the dean there is not my representative, he's my boss. Okay? Now, I mean, and everybody in that hall, you know, in a sense, we're used to this talk of politicians, yeah? Well, what that guy said, I think, just indicates, you know, where the gravity, where the push is going in all of our lives, is that hierarchies and unjustified people telling us what to do, we're just, you know, these are the long-term trends in modernity, is that we do not, or we are much less tolerant of being told how we think and who represents us. You know, we want to actually count for ourselves, and we want to be participants, and we want to be actors, not just in politics, but in our places of work. I think that's very, very important. We've been talking to Domingo over lunch. I mean, the whole economic side of democracy, of course, is something that we don't talk enough about. We don't talk enough about the need for cooperative styles of ownership. And we don't talk about how much more productive we can be when we feel a stake in the thing that we're working in. If everybody in university or everyone in a factory has a stake in that and they're participants in decision-making, I think to me it's much more productive, right? I mean, you know, I could go on about this, but I think these, you know, this desire to be an actor, to be a participant, to determine and to deliberate in all the aspects of our lives, whether it be a sporting club or university or politics, is one of the, you know, long-term stories of modernity, and it's a really, you know, it's very deep in the modern consciousness. This notion of not ceding power, not ceding our own autonomy, but rather, you know, getting to grips with our own lives, taking control.
Bueno, debemos terminar porque ya a las 9 ya cierran. Darle las gracias al profesor Tormey, Simon, por su intervención. Creo que nos ha ayudado mucho. El próximo año seguiremos, ¿no? Hemos prometido que seguiremos. Yo creo que sí que es posible una democracia, ¿no? Que no sea representativa, que sea participativa, por darle algún nombre, ¿no? Y creo que todo lo que estamos aprendiendo estos días nos va a ser muy necesario para entenderla. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you.